Ladies and gentlemen, today I would like to speak to you about a very distressing topic: genocide. When we think of genocide, images may come to mind of the concentration camps in Nazi Germany, or the killings that took place in Rwanda in the 1990s. However, today I would like to speak to you about genocide in a different part of the world, Latin America. I'm going to speak about one country in particular, Guatemala. I will start by going into some of the country's history before telling you about a recent court case which is of great importance for the whole of the continent. We will start by going back to Guatemala in the 1940s. The indigenous population in this country has always been large. Most native peoples in Guatemala are of Mayan origin. Despite being in the majority in Guatemala in the 1940s, the indigenous peoples did not hold any real power. The country was controlled by a mixed-race minority, known as the Ladino people. Ladinos trace their roots back to the Spanish who arrived during the colonial era, who then mixed with the native population. The fact that the Ladinos controlled the country in the 1940s, despite being a minority, led to tensions in Guatemalan society. These divisions then boiled over, creating unrest. The indigenous people were upset with the social inequalities that they saw around them. As a consequence of these uprisings, many changes took place. A series of reforms was introduced in order to make Guatemala a fairer country. Land was shared out, and more attention was paid to the way poor Guatemalans lived. However, as you might expect, not everyone was happy with these transformations. Many groups opposed the changes, and the reforms were seen in a negative light by some foreign governments as well. In particular, the US government was far from pleased about what was happening in Central America. The USA had certain vested interests in the country and wanted to maintain the status quo in Guatemala. These interests particularly came in the form of the United Fruit Company, an American multinational. This company had a monopoly over fruit production in Guatemala and did not want to lose its dominant position. What's more, the US government was opposed to the reforms that had been made, because they were perceived to be of a communist nature. The American government soon rolled out Operation Success, as it was called, in order to protect its interests in the region. This operation led to a change in the Guatemalan government. The president-elect was overthrown and replaced by a figure from the military. This new leader put an end to the reforms and used the army to repress any social demands. The indigenous population saw that the advances that had been made were soon reversed. The new regime intensified the racism that had already existed in the country for centuries. It made use of this racism as a tool for its own means. Discrimination against Mayan ethnic groups reached new levels. The situation degenerated, and the native peoples were soon faced with complete extermination. In the 1970s, there were countless cases of indigenous people being burnt alive. They suffered the most horrific types of torture, such as having their intestines ripped out while still alive, and their fingernails torn off. During these gruesome years, it seemed that the situation could not possibly get any worse. The indigenous people thought the suffering they had undergone could not possibly increase. However, there was worse yet to come. In the early 1980s, in addition to problems like those I've mentioned, many parts of Central America were riven by other forms of conflict. The unrest was especially acute in Guatemala and made the country's troubles even worse. An internal conflict ended up tearing the country apart. The strife culminated with another military leader taking over the country, This time it was José Efraín Ríos Montt. Although Ríos Montt was in power for only a short period, the torture, killing and destruction that Guatemala witnessed was colossal. Homes were burnt to the ground, crop harvests were destroyed, and women and children were killed indiscriminately. Those who tried to escape as refugees were killed by aerial bombing raids. Ríos Montt was only in power from March 1982 to August 1983, but his term as president saw many of the worst attacks against the civilian population in the country's history. His military strategy was incredibly savage, and he himself labeled it Scorched Earth, or Tierra Arrasada in Spanish. Although these horrors are now part of Guatemala's past, the wounds of the indigenous people are still wide open. Ríos Montt is still alive today, as are many of those who assisted him in committing his despicable crimes. However, for many years, the victims of this regime have been fighting for justice. More than 30 years have passed since the suffering took place, but victims and their families are not yet ready to forget. It is only now, after 3 decades, that these demands for justice are finally being heeded. After so many years, Ríos Montt is finally in the dock and being held accountable for the atrocities that he is responsible for. According to prosecutors, the former president is guilty of ordering the extermination of 1,700 Mayans. It has been a long, hard struggle getting to the court, but finally Ríos Montt is being made to explain the events of the early 1980s before a judge. As a matter of fact, this trial is a historic first. Never before has a Latin American court tried a former president for genocide. This is an encouraging achievement for the justice system in Guatemala and for the whole continent. Regardless of the sentence that Ríos Montt receives, the trial will allow the families of victims to feel at least some relief. However, nothing can undo all the injustices that the Mayan people suffered under Ríos Montt. What's more, although this case represents a watershed for Latin American justice, prosecutors are nonetheless facing huge difficulties. Many of the documents that prove that Ríos Montt ordered killings and torture have now been destroyed. This makes it frustratingly difficult to prove his guilt for these crimes. Furthermore, unfortunately, only one man is facing trial. Although Ríos Montt seems to bear most of the responsibility for these crimes, he did not act alone. Hundreds of others were complicit in these horrors. The charges being brought against Ríos Montt represent promising changes for Latin America, but more must be done. Greater efforts must be made in order to ensure that the victims of heinous crimes in years gone by in Guatemala are able to move on and look to a brighter future. Thank you.